She stood outside, watching my garage burn with a smile on her face, but that wasn't the moment my world fell apart, it had already begun months before. What led us here? Let me take you back to the beginning of the betrayal I never saw coming. It's strange how life can change so suddenly, like a switch you didn't see being flipped. I still can't get the image out of my head, Jessica standing outside the burning garage, her face illuminated by the flames, a subtle smirk curling at the edges of her lips. Everything I had poured my blood, sweat, and tears into was going up in smoke. And that's when it hit me, why was I even able to see this? What was I really looking at? Jessica and I have been married for 22 years. For most of those years, we were solid. At least, that's what I thought. But these last 3 months, something shifted. She started pulling away, avoiding the routines that had defined our life together. She wasn't herself. And last night's argument drained the last bit of energy I had. Jessica's temper has always been intense. She's strong-willed, stubborn as a bull, and never one to let go of a grudge. But I never imagined it would come to this. Let me introduce myself, Rick Aldridge, husband to Jessica for over 2 decades. This morning, I heard her say something that wouldn't leave my mind, "I like the way you do it." It wasn't the words themselves but the way she said it. Cold. Detached. Something about it hit differently this time, and that knot of tension that had been building for weeks tightened even more. In the early years of our marriage, we were inseparable. We had our struggles like anyone else, financial stress, long work hours, but we tackled those challenges head-on. I worked as a mechanic, putting in long shifts at the shop while Jessica handled sales at a local department store. It wasn't easy, but we were a team. We leaned on each other and somehow made it work. I'll never forget the day things started looking up for me career-wise. I was 28 when the owner of the auto shop where I worked approached me with an offer. He wanted me to manage one of his franchise locations. He said he valued not only my knowledge of cars but also my ability to connect with customers. Over dinner, he laid out the plan. I'd continue earning my regular salary, $6,000 a year, but in return, he'd set aside $20,000 each year toward a future down payment for me to eventually buy the shop outright. It felt like a turning point. We shook hands, and I walked away with a sense of hope for our future. But when I brought the news home to Jessica, expecting her to share my excitement, I was blindsided by her fury. She couldn't believe I hadn't consulted her first. The lack of a formal contract made her distrust the deal entirely. I tried to explain how this was a long-term investment in our family's future, but she shut me out for days. Her silence hung over the house like a storm cloud, and I began to worry about what would happen if the plan didn't work out. Jessica's temper. It's something I've had to contend with for years. She's had outbursts on camping trips, birthdays, even during family vacations. But I told myself it was just stress, especially after the kids came along. She returned to work, managing an insurance office, and I knew the pressure weighed on her. Still, something in her changed more drastically 2 years ago. Her temper flared more often, and her words cut deeper. It was like the woman I loved was being replaced by someone hardened and bitter. These past 3 months, the tension between us reached new heights. By last Friday, after yet another exhausting week, she came home late again. Her demands, her frustrations, everything was building to a point I couldn't ignore anymore. I was losing her, and I had no idea why. I snapped that night. Her constant demands, her coldness, it all became too much. "I'm not here just to wait on you hand and foot, Jessica," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I stormed off and ended up crashing in my son Mason's room. I was too angry to stay in the same bed with her. As I grabbed some clothes on my way out, my eyes caught a glimpse of her phone on the dresser. A text notification from someone named EF lit up the screen. So did he do it? Her earlier words, "I like the way you do it," echoed in my head, but now, those words carried a whole new weight. Was she comparing me to someone else? My stomach twisted. I tried to dismiss the thought, but I couldn't shake it. I felt sick, though sleep wouldn't come that night. Every time I closed my eyes, that message haunted me. Over the next couple of days, I found myself going through the motions, pretending to be sick so I wouldn't have to engage with her. I avoided her like the plague, barely speaking, barely looking her way. We still slept in the same bed, but the distance between us felt like an endless chasm. Love and resentment aren't far apart, I've learned. One can turn into the other so easily when trust starts to crack. Then it happened again. Late one night, I got up to use the bathroom. On my way back, I saw her phone on the nightstand, lit up once more with another message from EF. I made a reservation for Wednesday afternoon. A reservation? For a hotel? That was it. I knew I needed answers, and I couldn't ignore my suspicions anymore. Wednesday arrived, and I took a half day off work. I drove straight to her office, parking nearby around 2:30 in the afternoon. At first, I wondered if I had misjudged the situation. Her boss, Elton, left the building alone, walking to his car. Maybe I had read too much into the messages. But then, 15 minutes later, Jessica emerged. She walked briskly to her car, got in, and drove off. I followed, keeping my distance. She pulled into the parking lot of a rundown motel on the other side of town. My pulse quickened. I parked far enough away that she wouldn't see me, though I had a clear view of everything. I watched as she parked beside another car, Elton's car. They greeted each other like old friends, like something more. Then, they entered a room together, leaving no doubt in my mind about what was happening. Rage consumed me on the drive home. I could barely think straight, each mile stretching into an eternity. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I had made up my mind. Mason was still at baseball practice, giving me some time alone. Our house sat at the edge of town, with the garage serving as my man cave. It was my sanctuary, complete with a hoist for car repairs, all my tools, and even a bed for when I needed space after an argument. I moved some clothes and toiletries into the garage, mentally preparing for the confrontation ahead. Jessica came home around 5:30. I was sitting on the couch in the garage, pretending to watch TV, barely acknowledging her as she walked in. She asked where Mason was, and I answered coldly, probably out with his friends. She hesitated for a moment, then tried to act normal. Maybe we could spend the evening together, she offered, her tone almost hopeful. It was so out of place, almost like she was trying to butter me up. I played along, nodding and agreeing, though every nerve in my body was taut with anger. Later, after she came out of the bathroom, I couldn't even look at her the same way. This wasn't the woman I had built a life with. This was a stranger in the body of the person I had loved for over 2 decades. Her face, once so familiar and comforting, now felt foreign to me, hollow, almost. I clenched my fists and closed my eyes, willing myself to stay calm, trying to picture anything but this betrayal. As I rummaged through the nightstand drawer, she noticed and asked cautiously, "What are you doing?" Without missing a beat, I answered flatly, "Getting protection." The coldness in my voice was unmistakable. If she wanted to act like everything was normal, I wasn't going to make it easy. This was just the beginning of what was to come. I didn't trust her anymore. Jessica's mask finally dropped as she erupted into a full-blown tirade. "You're a failure," she screamed. "You haven't even asked for a raise in 8 years. I've lost all respect for you." Her words hit like a freight train, but I refused to engage. I quietly grabbed my clothes, got dressed, and headed out to the garage. I couldn't bear to stay in the house with her any longer. As I sat there, trying to calm my racing thoughts, I could still hear her from inside the house, her voice rising as she shouted for me to come back and face her. I knew her temper well, too well. Anticipating that things could escalate further, I made a decision I never thought I'd have to make. I called the police. Her fury only intensified. The pounding on the garage door started next, her fists slamming against the metal with alarming force. "You're pathetic," she shrieked, hurling obscenities as the echo of her rage filled the night. I gritted my teeth and waited, hoping the officers would arrive soon. And then, without warning, everything went quiet. The silence unnerved me more than her screaming had. Moments later, I caught the first whiff of smoke. My stomach dropped. I glanced out the garage window and froze in disbelief. Flames were crawling up the walls of the garage, spreading rapidly. And there she was, Jessica, standing outside with a twisted grin on her face as the fire consumed everything I'd built. I didn't have time to think. I bolted for the side window, smashing it open and climbing out as fast as I could. In my panic, I twisted my ankle on the landing, the sharp pain shooting through my leg. I scrambled on all fours, desperate to get to safety. Jessica's voice still carried through the air, laced with venom. She continued hurling insults until the sound of approaching sirens drowned her out. The police arrived just as the fire roared at full strength. One officer immediately radioed for the fire department, while another restrained Jessica and slapped handcuffs on her wrists. She fought against them, screaming like a madwoman. "Take it away, you idiots. Burn his precious doghouse to the ground." At the station, I gave a full statement while Jessica was charged with arson. The officers advised me to contact an attorney and file a restraining order. I spent that night on the phone with my lawyer, who referred me to a criminal defense specialist. By the next day, I'd filed for a restraining order, preventing Jessica from coming within 500 feet of me, my workplace, or our home. She remained in jail until her arraignment. Meanwhile, I had the gut-wrenching task of telling Mason and my daughter, Megan, what had happened. Their reactions couldn't have been more different. Megan, who had seen the worst of her mother's temper growing up, wasn't surprised. She hugged me quietly, offering her steady support. Mason, on the other hand, was furious. He couldn't understand how things had spiraled so far out of control, but he promised me he'd eventually come to terms with it. That weekend, I began the painful process of dealing with the wreckage. The garage was nearly a total loss. Some of my tools were salvageable, but my diagnostic equipment, the heart of my work, had been completely destroyed. Insurance was another looming question. Since Jessica co-owned the property, coverage wasn't guaranteed. I felt trapped, tangled in the legal and financial fallout of her actions. As I sifted through the ashes of both my garage and my marriage, one thought gnawed at me: Jessica's betrayal didn't happen overnight. The cracks had started forming long before the fire. Determined to understand, I decided to look deeper into Elton Forster, the man she'd met at work. I spent hours researching him online. He had been hired 2 years ago as a general manager at her office, the same time her behavior had started to change. Divorced with 3 kids, he lived about an hour away from us. It all lined up too neatly. The late nights, the secretive texts, the growing distance. For 2 years, I had been blind to the truth. Now, there was no going back. The life I thought I had was gone, replaced by the charred remnants of trust and the bitter knowledge of betrayal. By Sunday evening, I had a plan. I decided I'd reach out to Jessica's boss, Elton, on Monday. We weren't strangers. I knew him from company events and had serviced his car at my shop a few times. I needed answers, but first, I had to get through another night of strained silence. That night, the phone rang. It was Jessica. "I'm sorry for setting the garage on fire," she said, her voice low and almost hesitant. "So what?" I replied curtly. "What do you expect me to say?" "Does that mean I can come home now?" she asked, almost like she believed an apology was enough to erase the damage. "No. I've filed a restraining order," I said firmly. Her tone shifted to anger. "Mom and Dad bailed me out," she shot back. "I'm not exactly thrilled about that," I retorted. "Neither am I," she said, softening her tone again. "Can we at least talk, work this out?" "No, Jessica. There's nothing left to work out," I replied without hesitation. "Rick, you know I love you. It's just, my temper. I lose control sometimes," she pleaded. "No. I don't know if you love me. If you did, you wouldn't have slept with your boss," I countered sharply. "That's not true," she snapped defensively. "Which part isn't true? That I don't know if you love me, or that you're sleeping with him?" I demanded. "Both," she insisted. "Jessica, I saw you. At the motel. With him." "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice steady but cold. There was an audible gasp on the other end of the line. She had been caught, and for once, she didn't have a quick response. "Why?" I asked, pressing her for the truth. "It was a mistake. A one-time thing," she claimed, her words hollow and rehearsed. "Nonsense. I'm done with your lies," I said, cutting the conversation short. I ended the call and shut off my phone. I didn't want to hear any more excuses. About 30 minutes later, there was a knock at my door. Jessica's father, Mr. Holmes, stood on the porch. He had always been like a second dad to me, but now he looked confused and uneasy. "What did she tell you?" I asked, stepping outside to face him. "She said you two had a fight and you kicked her out," he explained. I shook my head in disbelief. "And how did she explain being in jail?" I pressed. "She told us she was burning your car manuals in the garage and that it got out of hand," he answered, looking uncomfortable. I crossed my arms and sighed. "You need to get the truth from her, Mr. Holmes." He studied me for a moment. "Are you going to tell me what happened?" he asked cautiously. "I don't think you want to hear it," I replied, my voice heavy with resignation. He frowned. "Why the formalities? You know I've always considered you a son." "Because soon we won't have that relationship anymore," I said quietly. "And you'll probably end up hating me." His eyes widened slightly. "Is it really that bad?" he asked hesitantly. I nodded, and he seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. No father wants to hear that his daughter is capable of such betrayal. He didn't press me further. Instead, he nodded solemnly and left. Later that night, I received a text from him. "I'm sorry. Jessica must have confessed." It didn't bring any comfort. The damage was done, and no apology, whether hers or her father's, was going to undo the wreckage of what she had set ablaze, both literally and figuratively. I could only imagine the firestorm brewing in Jessica's parents' house that night. The arguments, the accusations, it was almost too easy to picture. By Monday, the divorce papers were discreetly served to Jessica at her office. She didn't take it well. Within minutes, she was on the phone with me, her voice shaking with fury. "You damn prick," she screamed. I hung up without a word. I wasn't about to feed into her rage anymore. Determined to gain more perspective, I reached out to Elton's ex-wife, Ruth. I explained my situation, and to my surprise, she was more than willing to talk. She'd been through something similar and understood the devastation betrayal could bring. That Saturday, I made dinner reservations at Jessica's favorite restaurant and invited Mason and Megan to join me. I wanted Jessica, and by extension, Elton, to hear about it. The message needed to be loud and clear: life was moving forward without her. We arrived at the restaurant a little early, and not long after, Ruth walked in. "This is Ruth Forster," I said as I introduced her to my kids. "She's Elton's ex-wife." Mason raised an eyebrow, but Megan seemed to catch on immediately. Ruth didn't hold back. She shared her story over dinner, recounting how Elton's infidelity had led to their divorce. "Trust is the foundation of any relationship," she said at one point. "Without it, you have nothing." By the end of the meal, the atmosphere was lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. We spoke openly about everything that had happened. Megan admitted she had suspected something was wrong for over a year but hadn't wanted to bring it up. It was a relief to hear my kids process the situation without judgment. After dinner, Megan asked if I was heading home. I smiled and said, "I'm actually asking Ruth to dance." Ruth accepted with a warm smile, and we danced until late into the night. It felt freeing, like a moment of clarity after months of darkness. When the evening wound down, I drove her to her hotel. We met again the next morning for breakfast, which caught the attention of a curious waitress. I knew small-town gossip would ensure that word of this breakfast would reach Jessica. And sure enough, it did. Jessica called not long after. "So, now you're seeing other women," she accused bitterly. "Jessica, we're getting a divorce," I replied calmly. "There's nothing you can do to stop it." She didn't have a response for that. Within days, after what I assume was a stern conversation with her father, Jessica finally signed the divorce papers. It was over. Or so I thought. I didn't see Jessica again until Megan's graduation ceremony. It had been months since our last encounter, and she looked different, thinner, older, as though life had weighed her down in ways she couldn't hide. She approached me hesitantly. "Are you still seeing Elton's ex?" she asked, her voice laced with bitterness. "Ruth is amazing," I replied evenly. "Where's Elton?" She hesitated before answering. "He got fired. Moved out of state." "You didn't love me enough," I said quietly, the truth of it settling between us like a final nail in the coffin. As I walked away, I heard her break down in tears behind me. Later that week, we prepared for the open house to sell our home. Despite the divorce proceedings, we had agreed to host the event together. Seeing Jessica in those familiar surroundings was unexpectedly painful. Each room carried memories, some good, some bitter, and the weight of what we had lost pressed down on me. As I took the trash out to the curb, Jessica approached cautiously. "Thank you for letting me help with this," she said quietly. "You'll always be their mother," I replied without stopping, focusing on my task. "Rick, can you look at me?" she asked softly. I paused for a moment, wondering what she was searching for in that request, but deep down, I knew there was nothing left to say that could change what had already been broken. I stopped what I was doing and turned to face her. For the first time, Jessica's voice broke as she spoke. "I'm sorry, for what I did to us," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. It was the first genuine apology she had given me for the affair. "Why did you do it?" I asked quietly. Jessica's face crumpled. She shook her head, unable to speak, and then ran out of the room in tears, leaving me alone with questions that would likely never be answered. Months passed, and life slowly moved forward. The divorce was finalized last year. Megan received her college acceptance letter, and Mason opened his own auto repair shop, something that made me incredibly proud. Jessica and I eventually sold the house, splitting the modest equity that remained after taking out a second mortgage to cover tuition for Megan and help Mason start his business. Jessica had pleaded guilty to the arson charge. The court sentenced her to 2 years of probation, along with mandatory anger management classes and therapy. I wasn't sure if it would change her, but at least it was a step in the right direction. After the divorce was finalized, she reached out, asking if we could meet for dinner. I hesitated at first but ultimately agreed. When we met, she looked better, healthier, more composed. Over the course of the evening, she apologized again. "I lost respect for you, Rick," she admitted, her voice filled with regret. "Elton seemed ambitious, and I saw you as stagnant. But I realize now how wrong I was. You're an incredible man. I just didn't see it in time." Her words hung in the air between us. I appreciated the apology, but the damage couldn't be undone. Too much had happened. Meanwhile, Ruth and I had grown closer. One evening, over dinner, we found ourselves opening up about the past. "I need to be honest," I told her. There are two things you should know. First, I think you're an incredible woman. And second, a part of me still wants revenge. She smiled knowingly. You're not the only one. I never got the chance to get back at Elton for all the other women he cheated on me with. Maybe it's time to even the score, she said playfully. We shared a laugh, but there was something more behind her words. Later, we headed to the bedroom. Lying beside her afterward, I reflected on our connection. Ruth was amazing, but deep down, I realized I didn't want our relationship to be built on past wounds. There had to be something deeper. The next evening, I texted Jessica. Call me when you have time. Monday works. Nothing urgent. She called within minutes. Are you taking me up on my offer? She asked, her tone cautious. No, I replied with a chuckle. I'm exhausted. Ruth is very energetic. There was a pause before I heard her counting under her breath. Clearly, her anger management classes were having some effect. I didn't call you. I texted. You could have waited until Monday, she snapped but quickly tried to recover. Sorry. A week later, Elton resurfaced unexpectedly. He had heard through mutual connections about my relationship with Ruth and decided to stir up trouble. However, Ruth and I saw right through him. His antics only reaffirmed how far I had come, and how much he had lost. Then, one evening, I came down with a fever. Ruth called to check on me. I'm coming over to play nurse, she said before hanging up. An hour later, she was at my door, armed with soup and a warm smile. I hadn't realized how much I needed the company until that moment. In that quiet, comforting presence, I found something that wasn't about revenge or broken trust. It was about healing. And maybe, just maybe, I was finally starting to find my way forward. The following day, I worked a late shift, wrapping up around midnight. Before I left, Ruth pulled me in for a kiss and whispered, I hope this continues. Your touch is magical. Her words stayed with me as I drove home, a warmth spreading through me I hadn't felt in a long time. But peace didn't last long. The next day at work, my phone rang, Jessica. Her tone was sharp and accusatory right off the bat. What did you do? She demanded. Well, hello to you too, I replied dryly. Yeah, hi. What did you do? She pressed. Elton broke into my place and attacked me, I explained bluntly. That's not what he said, she shot back. I let out a sigh. Of course, Elton had spun his own version of events. I wasn't about to get dragged into a he-said-she-said battle with her over it. Later that evening, I stopped by a local bar, Smitty's, to unwind. I was nursing a drink when a group of women headed toward the restroom. One of them paused at my table and gave me a knowing look. You're Jessica's ex, right? She asked, her eyes twinkling mischievously. I nodded cautiously. Yeah, that's me. I've heard a lot about you, she said, smirking before walking away. I wasn't sure what she had heard, but I doubted it was flattering. Jessica wasn't exactly shy about airing her grievances. On their way back, both women stopped to flirt with me. They were bold, one was probably 10 years younger than me, the other closer to 15. Unlike men, they didn't seem to mind flirting with a friend's ex. I played along, thinking maybe it would annoy Jessica if word got back to her. That night, one of the women, Samantha, made quite the impression on me. We exchanged numbers before parting ways, and I couldn't stop thinking about her. The next day, I decided to give her a call. Hi, Samantha. This is Rick Aldrich. We met at Smitty's on Thursday, I said, trying to sound casual. Of course, I remember, she teased. The handsome man sitting alone. I blushed slightly. I was just unwinding and thinking. Would you like to talk about it? She offered. Yeah, I think I would, I admitted. How about tonight? She suggested. Sure. Smitty's at 7:30. I'll be there, she said warmly. I hung up feeling nervous. I hadn't been on a date in over 25 years. What could a younger woman possibly see in me? I put on some business casual clothes, wanting to make a good impression without overdoing it. That night, Samantha and I hit it off immediately. She had a way of making me feel at ease. Over drinks, she casually brought up Jessica. From what I gathered, the affair likely started about 3 months before you served her with divorce papers, she said thoughtfully. Her timeline matched the shift I'd noticed in Jessica's behavior. She continued, during bachelorette parties, your ex actually talked about you, specifically, how satisfied she was with you. Samantha paused, giving me an intense look. So naturally, I'm curious. I blushed, completely caught off guard. I never imagined Jessica would talk about me like that, especially to friends. Samantha smiled at my reaction. Don't be embarrassed, she said softly. If you're as good as she said, this is going to be fun. The tension between us thickened, and before long, we decided to head back to my place. We went straight to the bedroom, and by the time we finally fell asleep, it was nearly 10 a.m. The next day, we had a quiet lunch together before I dropped her off at her apartment. As she got out of the car, Samantha smiled and made me promise to call her again. I assured her I would. On the drive home, I couldn't help but reflect on how much my life had shifted in the past year. I had gone from betrayal and heartbreak to slowly rebuilding something new, something that felt real, exciting, and free of the shadows of the past. While sorting through my wallet, I stumbled upon a receipt from Smitty's. Scribbled on the back was the name, Kate, and her phone number. I smiled to myself. This new reality, women showing interest in me, was still something I was getting used to. On Monday after work, curiosity got the best of me, and I gave Kate a call. She answered with a cheerful tone, and after some small talk, I admitted, you caught me off guard at the bar. Why's that? She asked playfully. I guess I wasn't expecting someone like you to be interested. I prefer older guys, she replied without missing a beat. They're more mature and easier to get along with. We agreed to meet on Saturday, and when the day came, Grace, another woman I'd recently connected with, proved to be just as lively and engaging. We spent hours talking and laughing like old friends. It felt refreshing. By Wednesday, I had a date with Kate, and that evening went just as well. Like Samantha and Ruth before her, Kate leaned in close and said, I like the way you do it. I couldn't help but chuckle at how those words had come full circle. On Sunday, Ruth invited me over for dinner. After an incredible meal, we spent the rest of the night together, enjoying each other's company in a way that felt both comforting and exciting. For the first time in years, I was genuinely starting to enjoy being single. But, of course, Jessica couldn't stay out of my life for long. On Monday night, my phone rang, and the irritation was clear in her voice. What the hell do you think you're doing? She demanded. I'm living my life, Jessica. What does it matter to you? You're doing this just to make my life harder, she accused. I chuckled at the absurdity of it. No, but if it's making your life difficult, that's just a bonus. Don't be smug, she snapped. You have no idea what it's like. They whisper behind my back. I hear it everywhere. I can't believe she let him go. It's humiliating. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but then I remembered all the pain she'd caused. Still, I tried to be diplomatic. If it helps, I can ask them to keep things more private, I offered. No. Just stop seeing them, she demanded. That's not going to happen, I replied calmly. Unless they want to end things, I'm not stopping. You're an a-hole, she yelled before slamming the phone down. By Thursday, thoughts of Jessica began to surface more frequently. I started piecing together the timeline of her affair with Elton. Maybe it had started earlier than I had originally believed. Now, though, she seemed remorseful, but it was far too late for that. That night, Samantha called to check in. "What's up?" she asked casually. "Just bought a case of beer to drown my sorrows," I joked. "Need some company?" "You might be just what the doctor ordered," I replied with a grin. Over the next year, I found myself navigating a new kind of life. Samantha, Grace, Ruth, and Kate, all of them brought something unique to the table, and I enjoyed spending time with each of them. None of us were looking for anything serious, and I was content with that for now. However, part of me still felt unfinished business with Jessica. One evening, after a long day of work, I made an unexpected decision. I called her. "Would you like to meet for dinner?" I asked. There was a pause on the other end. "Dinner? Why?" "I think it's time we talked, Jessica." Surprisingly, she agreed. I made reservations at the finest restaurant in town, sparing no detail. I even arranged for a car to pick her up, insisting she dress elegantly for the occasion. When she arrived, she took my breath away. She wore a stunning long black dress that perfectly complemented her red hair and green eyes. For a fleeting moment, I saw the woman I had once loved, the one I thought I would spend forever with. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. This wasn't a romantic reunion. This was closure. We both knew that. As I watched Jessica that evening, I couldn't help but remember the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. There was a time when she had been my world. I took a deep breath, knowing I had to say what had been weighing on my mind for a long time. "Do you remember when I told you about the job opportunity at Auto Pro Supply?" I began. "I hoped it would give me a more flexible schedule so I could be around more for the family. But you were furious." Jessica lowered her gaze, her voice soft. "I remember. I did it for us, for our family. Every decision I made back then was to make our lives better," I continued. "And I ruined it all," she whispered, her voice breaking. I reached across the table, resting my hand near hers. "I didn't bring you here to relive bad memories," I said gently. "I brought you here because today, I signed the paperwork to purchase the Auto Pro Supply franchise. We now own 4 stores." Jessica's eyes widened in shock. "4 stores," she repeated. "This will ensure that our children have a strong inheritance," I explained. "This isn't just about the past anymore. It's about their future, and the future of their children." Jessica excused herself and headed to the restroom. I hadn't expected my news to affect her so deeply. I had intended this evening to be a celebration of new beginnings, not a reopening of old wounds. Seeing her reaction, I knew the night couldn't continue as planned. I signaled for the check and paid the bill, deciding it was time to take her home. When she returned, I stood and said, "I've already paid. Let me drive you home." "Thank you." "I'm sorry I ruined your evening," she murmured, tears still glistening in her eyes. During the ride, she cried quietly, and I let her. There were no words that could ease the complicated emotions between us. Some things are too deep to fully mend. Life moved on, as it always does. Mason was now engaged to a kind woman named Fiona, someone he had met at the shop. For their engagement party, we rented a room at the Sheraton and kept things simple, bringing in sandwiches from Subway. I arrived early to help Mason set up, and as we were finishing, Jessica walked in. She still looked good after all these years, though time had softened her presence. "We never had an engagement party," she said wistfully. "No," I replied, "but everyone we knew us." "Do you remember proposing to me?" she asked, her voice tinged with old emotion. "Yes, I do," I answered, feeling a twinge of the past stirring inside me. Jessica sighed deeply. "Sometimes. I wanted to hurt you because you hurt me so much," she admitted. I nodded, understanding the weight of her words but knowing there was no use dwelling on the pain now. We had both made mistakes that couldn't be undone. Later, Mason pulled me aside. "Dad," he said quietly, Fiona's very religious. She might not be into your lifestyle. I gave him a reassuring smile. Mason, before your mother left, I was a one-woman man. I want someone I can trust again. I'm not who I was after the divorce. I don't know if she'd give you a chance, but I'll introduce you, Mason offered. That would be great, I replied, appreciating his support. He led me over to Fiona and her mother, Mrs. Dodson. This is my father, Rick, Mason said proudly. Fiona greeted me warmly, and as the evening continued, I caught glimpses of a future that didn't feel weighed down by the past. Sometime later, I met someone named Ashley. We hit it off quickly, but she was upfront with me from the start. Rick, she said during breakfast at Cracker Barrel, I've heard some things about you. People say you're a womanizer. What do you have to say about that? I laughed softly and shook my head. I'm not a womanizer. After Jessica cheated on me and set my garage on fire, I started dating again. Women approached me, and I didn't say no. But I never chased anyone or treated them poorly. If that makes me a womanizer, then so be it. Ashley seemed to consider my words for a moment before smiling. I appreciate the honesty, she said. Over time, our connection deepened. One night, as we stood together on her front porch, I looked into her eyes and said, I love you. I think I'm falling in love with you too, she replied softly. 3 months later, we had a small wedding, surrounded by close family and friends. Jessica didn't attend. I understood, it would have been too painful for her to watch me move on. But that chapter of my life was firmly closed. For the first time in years, I had found happiness and peace. And this time, I wasn't looking back.